The coffee was still steaming when they found her car. Every morning at exactly 7:47 a.m., Jennifer Martinez would kiss her 8-year-old daughter Emma goodbye and drive the familiar route to Roosevelt Elementary School in Cedar Falls, Iowa. But on March 15, 2004, something went terribly wrong. Her silver Honda Accord sat abandoned on County Road 2018, engine running, driver's door hanging open, and that morning's coffee still warm in the cup holder. Jennifer was nowhere to be found. What happened during those missing 23 minutes would haunt this small farming community for the next 2 decades. Until a breakthrough in DNA technology finally revealed a truth so shocking that it would change everything they thought they knew about trust, family, and the person they'd all believed was trying to help. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing. The man responsible had been living right under their noses for 20 years, helping with community events, working alongside the very people searching for Jennifer, and no one suspected a thing. The evidence that would eventually solve this case was sitting in a coffee cup the entire time, waiting for technology that didn't exist yet to unlock its secrets. To understand how this case became one of Iowa's most baffling cold cases, we need to go back to that March morning, when everything seemed perfectly normal. Jennifer Martinez was the kind of mother every school wished they had more of. At 32, she worked part-time as a dental hygienist, while raising Emma as a single parent after her divorce 2 years earlier. She was punctual, reliable, and had never missed a school pickup in 3 years. Her daily routine was as predictable as clockwork. Wake up at 6:30, make breakfast, get Emma ready for school, and drive the 4.2-mile route to Roosevelt Elementary. The drive typically took exactly 12 minutes, and Jennifer always arrived by 8. Jennifer had grown up in Cedar Falls, the daughter of Robert and Maria Gonzalez, who had immigrated from Mexico in the 1960s and built a successful landscaping business. She was valedictorian of her high school class, earned a degree in dental hygiene from the University of Iowa, and returned home to raise her daughter in the same safe, close-knit community where she had grown up. Everyone knew Jennifer. She was the woman who volunteered for every school fundraiser, who organized the annual Cinco de Mayo celebration at the community center, and who never had a bad word to say about anyone. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Emma would later tell investigators that her mom seemed normal, maybe a little tired from working late at the dental office the night before, but nothing unusual. Jennifer made Emma's favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes, and packed her a lunch with the same note she always included: "Have a great day, sweetheart, mommy loves you." They left the house at 7:47 a.m., just like every other school morning for the past 3 years. Emma buckled herself into the back seat while Jennifer adjusted the radio to her favorite country station and took her first sip of coffee from the travel mug that would later become crucial evidence. But what Emma didn't know was that someone had been watching them. Someone who knew their routine so well that he could predict exactly where Jennifer would be at any given moment. Someone who had been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity. That opportunity came on a stretch of isolated road, where no one would see what happened next. The route to Roosevelt Elementary took them through downtown Cedar Falls, past Miller's hardware store, where Jennifer always waved to old Mr. Miller sweeping his front steps, then out onto County Road 2, a straight stretch of rural highway bordered by cornfields that wouldn't be planted for another month. It was during this final stretch, just 1.8 miles from the school, that something happened that would turn a routine Tuesday morning into every parent's worst nightmare. At 8:15 a.m., school secretary Mrs. Patterson noticed that Emma Martinez hadn't arrived for the morning bell. This was unusual because Jennifer was never late, but Mrs. Patterson assumed they might have encountered car trouble or a minor emergency. By 8:30, when Emma still hadn't appeared and Jennifer hadn't called, Mrs. Patterson began to worry. She tried Jennifer's cell phone 3 times but got no answer. At 8:45, she called the Cedar Falls Police Department to report that one of their most reliable parents had simply failed to show up. Officer Mike Rodriguez was the first to respond, driving the route that Jennifer would have taken from her house to the school. What he found would become one of the most puzzling crime scenes in Iowa history. He found her car at 9:23 a.m., sitting at an angle across the center line of County Road 218, approximately 2 miles from Roosevelt Elementary. The silver Honda Accord's engine was still running. The driver's door was wide open, and Jennifer's purse sat untouched on the passenger seat. Most eerily, her coffee was still warm to the touch, suggesting that whatever had happened had occurred very recently. The scene was both mundane and terrifying in its implication. Jennifer's car showed no signs of mechanical problems. The engine ran smoothly, the tires were properly inflated, and there were no warning lights on the dashboard. There was no evidence of an accident, No skid marks on the asphalt, no damage to the vehicle itself. Jennifer's personal belongings were exactly where they should be. Her purse contained her wallet, with $47 in cash, and all her credit cards. Her keys dangled from the ignition, and her cell phone sat in the cup holder next to that still warm coffee. But Jennifer Martinez was gone, vanished. As if she had simply evaporated from the driver's seat of her own car while it was moving down a rural highway at 8 a.m. The only clue that something was wrong was Emma, still strapped in her car seat in the back, crying and asking where her mommy had gone. The 8-year-old would later tell investigators that she had fallen asleep during the drive and woke up when the car stopped moving. She couldn't remember hearing any voices, any sounds of struggle, or anything unusual at all. But what Emma didn't know was that her mother had been approached by someone she recognized, someone she trusted enough to roll down her window. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the scene at 10:15 a.m., taking over what had initially been treated as a possible medical emergency or simple missing person case. Chen was a 15-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, experienced in domestic disputes and property crimes, but completely unprepared for the impossibility of what she was seeing. How does a woman disappear from a moving vehicle on a straight stretch of highway with no witnesses, no evidence of foul play, and no logical explanation? Chen's first instinct was to look for rational explanations. Medical emergency? Jennifer's doctor would later confirm that she was in perfect health with no history of seizures, fainting spells, or mental health issues. Voluntary disappearance? Jennifer had $47 in her purse, hardly enough to start a new life, and she had never expressed any desire to leave Cedar Falls or abandon her daughter. Custody dispute? Jennifer's ex-husband lived in California and had a solid alibi, working at a construction site with dozens of witnesses that morning. The initial investigation focused on the most obvious possibilities, but each avenue led to a dead end. Jennifer's bank accounts showed no unusual activity in the weeks before her disappearance. Her phone records revealed only routine calls to family, friends, and Emma's school. Her internet browsing history contained nothing more interesting than recipes and Emma's homework help website. Jennifer Martinez appeared to be exactly what she seemed: a devoted single mother living a quiet, unremarkable life in small-town Iowa. But Detective Chen couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from the picture. The crime scene was too clean, too convenient. Cars don't just stop running in the middle of the road without reason. Women don't simply vanish into thin air. Someone had to know something. Someone had to have seen something. But in a case that would define her career for the next 20 years, Chen was about to discover just how wrong those assumptions could be. The search for Jennifer began immediately and was unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever seen. Within hours of her car being discovered, volunteers from across the county were combing the cornfields and drainage ditches along County Road. The Iowa National Guard provided helicopters. The State Patrol brought in specialized search equipment, and volunteers came from as far away as Des Moines to join the effort. At its peak, the search involved over 500 people covering an area of nearly 100 square miles. Search and rescue teams brought dogs that followed Jennifer's scent from her abandoned car for approximately 200 yards before losing the trail completely at a spot where the pavement met a gravel farm road. The dogs circled in confusion, unable to pick up any trace of where Jennifer might have gone from that point. This detail would later prove more significant than anyone realized at the time. The scent trail ended exactly where another vehicle would have been parked. Helicopters from the Iowa State Patrol searched the area from above, while ground teams examined every barn, outbuilding, and abandoned farmhouse within a 10-mile radius of where the car was found. Divers searched the Cedar River and every pond and creek in the area. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation brought in specialized equipment to scan for underground disturbances that might indicate a hastily dug grave. After 5 days of intensive searching involving over 300 volunteers and multiple law enforcement agencies, they had found absolutely nothing. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. Jennifer's disappearance had all the elements that capture public fascination: a devoted mother, a mysterious vanishing, and a complete lack of logical explanation. Cable news programs picked up the story, featuring Jennifer's photograph and details about her disappearance during primetime broadcasts. Nancy Grace devoted an entire segment to the case, interviewing Jennifer's parents and Detective Chen via satellite. The parking lot at Roosevelt Elementary became a staging area for reporters from Des Moines, Chicago, and eventually national networks who descended on Cedar Falls like an occupying army. Emma Martinez became the face of the tragedy, photographed holding her mother's picture and asking when mommy was coming home. The image was broadcast across the country, generating thousands of tips and alleged sightings from every state. Jennifer had been seen at a truck stop in Nebraska, working as a waitress in Montana, boarding a bus in Florida. Each lead required investigation, each investigation consumed precious resources, and each dead end pushed the case further from resolution and deeper into the realm of unsolved mysteries. The psychological toll on Jennifer's family was devastating. Her parents, Robert and Maria Gonzalez, took custody of Emma and moved her into their home in nearby Waterloo. The transition was traumatic for everyone involved. Emma had never spent more than a weekend away from her mother, and couldn't understand why Jennifer had left her behind. She suffered from nightmares, bedwetting, and episodes where she would hide in closets waiting for her mother to come find her. Maria Gonzalez, Jennifer's mother, aged 10 years in the first month after the disappearance. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and spent her days calling the police department for updates that never came. Robert threw himself into the search efforts, organizing volunteer groups and funding searches long after the official investigation had scaled back. The couple's marriage, strong for 35 years, began to crack under the pressure of grief and helplessness. Emma's behavioral changes were heartbreaking to witness. The normally outgoing 8-year-old became withdrawn and clingy, refusing to let her grandparents out of her sight. She stopped playing with her toys, stopped watching her favorite cartoons, and would sit for hours staring out the window as if willing her mother to come walking up the driveway. Child psychologists worked with Emma, but how do you explain to a child that her mother didn't choose to leave but simply disappeared from existence? The community of Cedar Falls rallied around the family with typical Midwestern compassion. The local churches organized meal trains, businesses donated money for search efforts, and volunteers continued to look for Jennifer long after law enforcement had moved on to other cases. But underneath the surface support, whispers began to circulate. Some people wondered if Jennifer had staged her own disappearance, overwhelmed by the pressures of single motherhood. Others suggested that she might have been having an affair and had run off with her lover. These theories were groundless and cruel, but they reflected the community's desperate need for an explanation that made sense. Detective Chen found herself consumed by a case that defied every investigative technique she had learned during her career. She interviewed Jennifer's co-workers at the dental office, her neighbors, friends from high school, and casual acquaintances from the grocery store. She reviewed Jennifer's phone records, credit card statements, internet browsing history, and even her library checkout records, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. The picture that emerged was of a woman whose life was so normal and routine that her sudden disappearance seemed even more impossible. The physical evidence was minimal and contradictory. Jennifer's car had been processed for fingerprints, DNA, and any trace evidence that might indicate the presence of another person. The results were frustratingly ordinary. Only Jennifer's fingerprints and DNA were found in the vehicle, along with traces that could be attributed to Emma and the dealership mechanics who had serviced the car. There were no signs of struggle, no foreign DNA, no fibers or hair that couldn't be accounted for, or so they thought at the time. One detail that initially seemed promising was Jennifer's employment at Dr. Whitman's dental practice. The office had recently hired a new dentist, Marcus Webb, who had joined the practice just 2 months before Jennifer's disappearance. Webb was 38, recently divorced, and had moved to Cedar Falls from Minneapolis after his previous practice had failed. Several of Jennifer's coworkers mentioned that Dr. Webb had shown interest in Jennifer, asking her personal questions and inviting her to lunch. Jennifer had politely declined his advances but hadn't reported feeling threatened or uncomfortable. Detective Chen interviewed Dr. Webb extensively, finding him to be cooperative but somewhat defensive about his relationship with Jennifer. He admitted to being attracted to her but claimed that he had accepted her lack of interest and had maintained a purely professional relationship. His alibi for the morning of March 15th was solid. He had been at the dental office since 7 a.m., preparing for his first patient at 8:30. The office security system confirmed his presence, and his first patient, Miss Eleanor Patterson, the same school secretary who had reported Emma's absence, arrived on time and confirmed that Dr. Webb had seemed completely normal. But Chen's investigation revealed something troubling about Dr. Webb's past. His previous practice in Minneapolis had failed not due to financial difficulties, as he had claimed, but because of a sexual harassment lawsuit filed by a former employee. The case had been settled out of court, and Webb's dental license had been suspended for 6 months. He had moved to Cedar Falls specifically to escape the scandal and start fresh. This information hadn't been discovered during his hiring process, because the dental practice had conducted only cursory background checks. Despite these revelations, Chen couldn't connect Dr. Webb to Jennifer's actual disappearance. His alibi was ironclad, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. Webb became a person of interest, but never a prime suspect. Years later, investigators would learn that while Webb wasn't responsible for Jennifer's disappearance, his inappropriate behavior toward female employees continued throughout his career in Cedar Falls. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to take on the characteristics of a cold case. The intensive search efforts were scaled back, the media attention moved on to other stories, and the dozens of investigators who had been assigned to the case were reassigned to newer emergencies. Detective Chen continued to work Jennifer's case alongside her other responsibilities, but the lack of new evidence or viable leads meant that progress essentially stopped. The community of Cedar Falls, initially united in their determination to find Jennifer, gradually returned to their normal routines as the investigation stalled and hope faded. The yellow ribbons that had adorned every tree and lamppost began to fade and fall away. The volunteer search groups disbanded as winter arrived and made outdoor searches impossible. The case that had consumed the town's attention for months became something people spoke about in hushed tones, then eventually stopped mentioning at all. By the first anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance, the case had settled into the heartbreaking pattern of all unsolved missing person cases. Detective Chen still received occasional tips and alleged sightings, but most proved to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. The annual memorial service held at Roosevelt Elementary drew smaller crowds each year, as people moved on with their lives and new tragedies demanded attention. Jennifer Martinez was becoming a memory, a cautionary tale, a name on a missing person database that grew longer every year. But Detective Chen refused to let the case die completely. Every few months, she would return to Jennifer's file, reviewing the evidence and witness statements for details that might have been overlooked. She maintained contact with Jennifer's family, updating them on any developments no matter how minor. She kept Jennifer's photograph on her desk as a reminder that somewhere, somehow there were answers to questions that had consumed her professional life and haunted her dream. What Chen didn't know was that the person responsible for Jennifer's disappearance was watching the investigation unfold with great interest. He read every newspaper article, watched every television report, and even attended some of the community meetings about the search effort. He was hiding in plain sight, and his ability to maintain a normal facade while carrying such a terrible secret would prove to be his greatest asset, and ultimately, his downfall. The case took an unexpected turn in 2007, when the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation received a tip from an inmate at the state penitentiary in Fort Madison. Marcus "Tank" Williams, serving time for armed robbery, claimed that his cellmate had confessed to killing a woman in Cedar Falls and burying her body on his family's property. The cellmate, Danny Morrison, was nearing the end of his sentence for burglary and had apparently been haunted by guilt over the crime. Detective Chen drove to Fort Madison to interview Williams, who provided detailed information about Morrison's alleged confession. According to Williams, Morrison had described picking up a woman who was having car trouble on a rural road, sexually assaulting her, and killing her when she tried to escape. Morrison had supposedly buried the body on his grandfather's abandoned farm property outside Cedar Falls, and had lived with the secret ever since. The details were compelling enough to warrant further investigation. Danny Morrison was indeed from the Cedar Falls area, and his grandfather had owned a 160-acre farm that had been vacant since the old man's death. And Morrison had been released from prison 2 months earlier, and had returned to Cedar Falls, where he was living in a halfway house and working at a local factory. When Chen contacted the halfway house, she learned that Morrison had been acting strangely since his release, drinking heavily and making cryptic comments about having done terrible things in his past. Chen obtained a search warrant for the Morrison property and organized a systematic search of the farmland, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. The search took 3 days and covered the entire 160 acres, focusing on areas that showed soil disturbance or other signs of recent digging. The effort involved dozens of investigators and volunteers, and for the first time in years, Jennifer's family allowed themselves to hope that they might finally get answered. But the search yielded nothing. The cadaver dogs found no trace of human remains, and the ground-penetrating radar detected no anomalies consistent with a grave. When confronted with the lack of evidence, Marcus Williams admitted that he had fabricated Morrison's confession in hopes of receiving favorable treatment for his own parole hearing. Morrison, meanwhile, had a solid alibi. For March 15, 2004, he had been in jail in Polk County serving a sentence for public intoxication. The false lead was devastating for Jennifer's family and represented a new low point in an investigation that had already endured years of disappointments. Emma, now 12 years old, had allowed herself to believe that they might finally be able to lay her mother to rest. When the search came up empty, she retreated even further into herself, refusing to discuss her mother or participate in any activities related to the case. The investigation continued to generate occasional leads over the following years, but none proved more substantial than the Morrison dead end. In 2009, a construction worker claimed to have found human remains while digging a foundation in Waterloo, but the bones turned out to be from a Native American burial site that was at least 200. In 2012, a psychic from California contacted the police, claiming to have visions of Jennifer's burial location, but her predictions led searchers to empty fields and abandoned buildings. Perhaps the most painful false hope came in 2014 when a woman in Phoenix, Arizona, contacted police claiming to be Jennifer Martinez. The woman, who was suffering from amnesia following a car accident, bore a superficial resemblance to Jennifer and had no memory of her life before the accident. For 2 weeks, Jennifer's family believed that their prayers had been answered and that Jennifer was alive but suffering from memory loss. DNA testing quickly proved that the woman was not Jennifer, but the emotional roller coaster left Emma and her grandparents more devastated than ever. By 2015, more than 11 years after Jennifer's disappearance, the case had been officially classified as a cold case. Detective Chen had been promoted to sergeant and had taken on supervisory responsibilities that limited the time she could devote to individual cases. New detectives occasionally reviewed Jennifer's file, but the investigation had essentially stopped making progress. The evidence room contained boxes of materials that had been examined hundreds of times without yielding any new insight. Emma Martinez graduated from high school in 2014 and enrolled at the University of Iowa to study education, following in her mother's footsteps as someone who wanted to work with children. At 18, she had lived more than half her life without her mother, and the act of grieving had evolved into a constant, low-level ache that influenced every decision she made. She chose to study close to home so she could remain near her grandparents, who had become increasingly frail as they aged. The psychological impact of unresolved grief was evident in every aspect of Emma's life. She struggled to form close relationships, always expecting people to disappear without warning. She had difficulty trusting others, and often interpreted innocent comments as potential threats. Despite counseling and the love of her extended family, Emma carried emotional scars that would never fully heal. Robert and Maria Gonzalez had spent their life savings on private investigators, search efforts, and reward offers that never produced results. Their once thriving landscaping business had suffered as they devoted their time and energy to finding their daughter. By 2015, Robert's health was failing, and Maria had developed serious depression that required medication and ongoing therapy. The couple had sacrificed everything in their pursuit of answers that seemed to exist just beyond their reach. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 2018, 14 years after Jennifer's disappearance, Cedar Falls hired a new police chief who was committed to using modern technology to solve cold cases. Chief Patricia Martinez, no relation to Jennifer, had experience with genetic genealogy and other advanced forensic techniques that hadn't been available during the original investigation. She authorized the re-examination of all physical evidence from Jennifer's case, using current DNA analysis methods. The renewed forensic examination focused on items that had been collected but never thoroughly analyzed due to the limitations of Jennifer's coffee cup, preserved in the evidence locker for 14 years, contained microscopic traces of saliva that previous testing had been unable to process. The original DNA analysis in 2004 had been able to confirm that Jennifer had drunk from the cup, but the technology wasn't sensitive enough to detect trace amounts of DNA from other sources. Using advanced DNA extraction techniques developed for analyzing degraded samples, the state crime lab was able to develop a genetic profile that included contributions from 2 individuals, Jennifer Martinez and an unknown male subject. The discovery of unknown DNA in Jennifer's coffee cup was the first concrete piece of evidence that proved another person had been involved in her disappearance. After 14 years of questions, investigators finally had proof that Jennifer hadn't simply vanished. She had been taken by someone who had gotten close enough to drink from her cup. The DNA profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which compared genetic markers against millions of profiles from convicted criminals, arrestees, and evidence from other unsolved crimes. The search produced no matches, indicating that Jennifer's abductor had never been arrested for a felony crime requiring DNA submission, or had committed the crime before DNA collection became standard practice. Sergeant Chen, now the department's lead investigator for cold cases, worked with Dr. Rebecca Torres, a forensic genealogist who specialized in using consumer DNA databases to solve crimes. The technique had been used successfully to solve several high-profile cold cases, including the Golden State Killer case in California. The process involved uploading the unknown male's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where people who had taken ancestry tests could share their genetic information to find relatives. The genealogical analysis took months of painstaking research. Torres identified distant relatives of the unknown subject and began constructing family trees that traced genetic relationships back through multiple generations. The work required examining birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and census data from across the Midwest, looking for patterns that might lead to a specific individual who could have been in Cedar Falls on March 5th. The process was complicated by the fact that the DNA sample was degraded and partial, providing only a limited number of genetic markers to work with. Torres had to cast a wide net, examining dozens of potential family lines and eliminating possibilities one by one through careful genealogical research. The work was tedious and often frustrating, requiring expertise in both genetics and historical research. The breakthrough came when Dr. Torres identified a strong genetic match with a man named Stanley Kowalski, who had submitted his DNA to an ancestry website to research his Polish immigrant ancestors. Stanley lived in Michigan and had no connection to Iowa, but his genetic profile suggested that the unknown Cedar Falls suspect was likely a close relative, possibly a brother, uncle, or cousin. Torres began constructing a comprehensive family tree for the Kowalski family, tracing their immigration from Poland in the early 1900s and following their descendants across the Midwest. The research revealed that Stanley had several male relatives who had lived in Iowa during the relevant time period, including a cousin named Tommy Kowalski, who had been born and raised in Cedar Falls. Thomas Kowalski was 42 years old at the time of Jennifer's disappearance and worked for the Buchanan County Road Department as a maintenance worker. His job involved repairing roads, clearing debris, and responding to traffic incidents throughout the county, which would have given him legitimate reasons to be driving County Road 2. More significantly, employment records showed that Tommy had been assigned to repair winter damage on County Road 218 during the week of March 15. Sergeant Chen's investigation into Tommy Kowalski's background revealed a troubling pattern that had somehow been overlooked during the original investigation. Tommy had been questioned briefly in 2004 as part of the routine canvass of county employees who might have seen something unusual on County Road 218. But his interview had been perfunctory and no one had thought to look deeper into his background. He had presented himself as a helpful county worker who was concerned about finding the missing woman, and his cooperation had apparently been taken at face value. The renewed investigation revealed that Tommy had a history of concerning behavior toward women that had been documented but never seriously investigated. In 1998, he had been arrested for stalking a female co-worker at the road department, but the charges were dropped when the woman left town and refused to pursue the case. In 2001, he had been questioned about harassing phone calls made to several women in Cedar Falls, but investigators couldn't prove he was responsible. In 2003, just months before Jennifer's disappearance, he had been fired from a part-time job at a local restaurant for making inappropriate comments to female customers and employees. Despite this pattern of problematic behavior, Tommy had never been convicted of a serious crime, which explained why his DNA wasn't in the CODIS database. He had always managed to avoid significant consequences for his actions, often because victims were intimidated into not pressing charges or because evidence was insufficient for prosecution. His position as a county employee had provided him with a veneer of respectability that helped him avoid serious scrutiny. Tommy lived alone in a trailer on his deceased parents' property, approximately 7 miles from where Jennifer's car had been found. He had never married, had few close relationships, and was known in the community as something of a loner who kept to himself. Neighbors described him as quiet and helpful when approached, but noted that he seemed to have no close friends and rarely participated in community activity. The property where Tommy lived was isolated and bordered by cornfields on 3 sides, providing complete privacy for any activities he might want to conceal. Aerial photographs showed several outbuildings on the property, including a large barn that hadn't been used for farming in decades. The location would have been perfect for someone who needed to dispose of evidence or conceal a crime. Chen began building a case against Tommy Kowalski while conducting covert surveillance to establish his current behavior patterns and mental state. The DNA evidence provided probable cause for a search warrant, but Chen wanted to build the strongest possible case before making an arrest. Tommy Kowalski had lived as a free man for 18 years while Jennifer's family suffered with unanswered questions. Chen was determined to ensure that when charges were filed, they would stick. The surveillance revealed that Tommy's behavior had become increasingly erratic in recent years. He had been forced into early retirement from his county job in 2016 due to budget cuts, and had spent his days since then driving aimlessly around rural roads, often stopping at locations that had no apparent purpose. He had developed a drinking problem and had been arrested twice for DUI, though he had managed to avoid serious jail time. Most disturbingly, Tommy had been spotted multiple times near Roosevelt Elementary during school pickup hours, watching from his truck as parents collected their children. When approached by school security, he claimed to be visiting the area on county business, but his retirement made these explanations increasingly implausible. The school had banned him from the property after several complaints from concerned parents. Chen also discovered that Tommy had maintained an unusual interest in Jennifer's case over the years. He had attended several of the annual memorial services, had contributed money to the reward fund, and had even volunteered for some of the later search efforts. This behavior fit a pattern often seen in criminals who insert themselves into investigations of their own crimes, driven by a need to monitor the progress of law enforcement and relive their criminal acts. The decision to arrest Tommy Kowalski was made in early 2020, 16 years after Jennifer's disappearance. Chen had assembled a compelling case based on the DNA evidence, Tommy's opportunity and means to commit the crime, his history of problematic behavior toward women, and his suspicious activities in the years since Jennifer's disappearance. The arrest was planned for March 15, 2020, exactly 16 years after Jennifer had vanished. But the arrest had to be postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which shut down much of the criminal justice system and limited law enforcement activities to emergency situations only. Tommy remained under surveillance while Chen waited for conditions to improve and for the courts to resume normal operations. During this delay, Tommy's behavior became even more erratic, suggesting that he might be aware that investigators were closing in on him. The arrest finally took place on March 15, 2021. Exactly 17 years after Jennifer Martinez had vanished from County Road. Tommy Kowalski was taken into custody at his trailer home without incident, though investigators noted that he showed no surprise when they arrived with arrest warrants. His first words to Sergeant Chen were, "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." The interrogation that followed was unlike anything Chen had experienced in her career. Tommy didn't deny his involvement in Jennifer's disappearance, but he also didn't provide a complete confession. Instead, he spoke in fragments and half-admissions, describing events as if they had happened to someone else, or as if he was recounting a dream rather than a crime he had committed. His mental state appeared to have deteriorated significantly over the years, possibly due to his drinking problem and the psychological stress of carrying his secret for so long. According to Tommy's disjointed account, he had been working on County Road 218 that March morning when he saw Jennifer's car approaching. He claimed that he had been obsessed with Jennifer for months, watching her daily routine and fantasizing about approaching her. When he saw her car that morning, he made a split-second decision to flag her down under the pretense of warning her about road construction ahead. Jennifer had pulled over and rolled down her window to hear what Tommy was saying. She had been polite but seemed impatient to continue to the school, concerned about being late for Emma's drop-off. Tommy claimed that he had intended only to talk to her, but when she started to drive away, something inside him snapped. He forced his way into her car, overpowering her despite her attempts to resist. The struggle was brief but violent, occurring while Emma slept in the back seat. Jennifer fought back, scratching and clawing at her attacker, but Tommy was larger and stronger. He managed to subdue her by pressing on her throat until she lost consciousness, then loaded her unconscious body into his county work truck. He drove her car to the location where it was found, positioning it to make it appear that she had simply vanished while driving, then returned for his truck. Tommy's description of what happened next was confused and contradictory. He claimed that Jennifer had regained consciousness while being transported to his property and had tried to escape from the moving truck. In his struggle to control her, he had caused her to strike her head against the dashboard, causing fatal injury. Tommy insisted that he had never intended to kill Jennifer, that her death had been an accident that occurred during his attempt to kidnap her. Whether Jennifer's death was intentional or accidental became a moot point when Tommy led investigators to her burial site. On his property, approximately half a mile from his trailer, he showed them a spot beneath an old oak tree where he had buried Jennifer's body 17 years earlier. The grave was shallow and unmarked, covered by years of accumulated leaves and debris that had helped conceal it from detection. The excavation that followed was conducted with extreme care to preserve any evidence that might remain after so many years underground. Jennifer's remains were found wrapped in a canvas tarp that Tommy had taken from his work truck, along with clothing and personal items that confirmed her identity. The forensic examination would later reveal evidence of the struggle that Tommy had described, including injuries consistent with strangulation and blunt force trauma. The discovery of Jennifer's body provided closure for her family but also raised new questions about Tommy Kowalski's activities during the 17 years since the murder. Investigators found evidence in his trailer that suggested he had been stalking other women in the Cedar Falls area, including photographs taken without their knowledge and detailed notes about their daily routine. The investigation expanded to examine several other unsolved cases involving missing women from the region, looking for connections to Tommy's pattern of behavior. Emma Martinez, now 25 years old and working as a teacher in Cedar Falls, was finally able to lay her mother to rest. The funeral held in April 2021 drew hundreds of mourners, including many who had participated in the original search effort 17 years earlier. Emma spoke about her mother's love and dedication, her own journey of healing, and her gratitude to the investigators who had never given up on finding the truth. The impact of finally knowing what had happened to her mother was both liberating and devastating for Emma. She had spent most of her life wondering if Jennifer was still alive somewhere, possibly suffering from amnesia, or being held against her will. Learning that her mother had died on the same day she disappeared, and that her death had been the result of a violent crime, was almost harder to bear than not knowing had been. But it also allowed Emma to finally begin the grieving process that had been frozen in place for 17 years. Robert and Maria Gonzalez, now in their late 70s and in failing health, lived just long enough to see their daughter's killer brought to justice. Robert died of heart failure 2 months after Tommy's arrest, and Maria followed 6 months later. Their final months were spent knowing that Jennifer's death had been avenged, and that the man responsible would never be able to hurt anyone else's family. The trial of Tommy Kowalski was scheduled for September 2021, but he died of a massive heart attack in his jail cell in July before he could face justice in court. His death cheated Jennifer's family of the satisfaction of seeing her killer convicted and sentenced, but it also provided a form of closure, knowing that he would never be able to hurt anyone else. The autopsy revealed that Tommy had suffered from severe coronary artery disease, likely exacerbated by years of heavy drinking and the psychological stress of carrying his terrible secret. In a twisted sense of irony, the guilt and fear that had protected him for 17 years may have ultimately contributed to his death. Following Tommy's death, investigators found additional evidence in his trailer that connected him to at least 3 other unsolved missing person cases in the region. Photographs, newspaper clippings, and detailed surveillance notes suggested that Jennifer Martinez hadn't been his only victim. The investigation into these connections continues today, offering hope to other families who have waited years for answers about their missing loved one. The case of Jennifer Martinez became a landmark in the use of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases, demonstrating how modern technology could provide answers to questions that had seemed impossible to solve, using traditional investigative methods. The DNA evidence recovered from that coffee cup, evidence that had sat in storage for 17 years waiting for technology to catch up, became the key that unlocked a mystery that had haunted an entire community. Detective Sergeant Chen, who had worked the case for 17 years, finally felt able to close the file that had defined her career. She established a scholarship in Jennifer's name for young women studying criminal justice, ensuring that Jennifer's legacy would continue to help others seek truth and justice. Chen retired from the police force in 2022, knowing that her most important case had finally reached its conclusion. For the community of Cedar Falls, Jennifer's case served as a sobering reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight. Tommy Kowalski had been a familiar figure for decades, working alongside the very people who had searched for Jennifer, attending community meetings about her disappearance, and even contributing to the reward fund for information about her fate. His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while harboring such dark secrets challenged everyone's assumptions about the nature of predators and the safety of their small town. Emma Martinez, now able to move forward with her life, established the Jennifer Martinez Foundation to support families of missing persons and to fund research into genetic genealogy techniques that might help solve other cold cases. The foundation has already contributed to solving 5 other missing person cases in Iowa and neighboring states, proving that Jennifer's legacy extends far beyond her own tragic story. The memorial marker on County Road 2018, placed at the spot where Jennifer's car was found, now reads, "In memory of Jennifer Martinez, beloved mother, daughter, and friend. Justice served, never forgot." The marker serves as a reminder that behind every cold case is a real person with a real family who deserves answers, no matter how long it takes to find them. The steaming coffee cup that started this story became the key to solving it 17 years later, containing the DNA evidence that would eventually lead investigators to Tommy Kowalski. Sometimes the smallest details, preserved against all odds, can provide the answers to the biggest mystery. Jennifer Martinez's case proves that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that advances in technology can breathe new life into even the coldest of cases. Today, the genetic genealogy techniques that solved Jennifer's case are being used to examine evidence from hundreds of other cold cases across the country. Each solved case brings hope to families who have waited years or decades for answers, proving that the truth has a way of surfacing even when it seems buried forever under secrets and lies. If you've been following this case and others like it, you understand the importance of never giving up hope, and always believing that justice, however delayed, can still be served. The technology that brought closure to Emma Martinez and her family is working right now to solve other mysteries, bringing peace to families who have suffered in silence for far too long. Every case solved brings us one step closer to ensuring that no one simply vanishes without a trace, and that every victim receives the justice they deserve, no matter how many years it takes to achieve.